I'm Dominique de Vrieze. I was looking forward to a very relaxed POPL this year because I didn't have to present anything myself. And then, of course, my co-author, Lau, who I suspect is watching through that camera there, fell ill, which means that I get to have experienced the stress of a POPL talk after all. Okay, so let me get started. When we write software, this is what actually runs on our machines. There are some assembly instructions that the machine runs over and jumps everywhere, and etc. And this is fortunately not what we write in source code. So what we write our source code in some favorite programming language in which there are abstractions that we can make use of. For example, we might have some C-like language where there's a stack and we can invoke functions, and when we invoke the function, we can sort of be sure that the function is going to return, after the place where we invoked it. We can have local variables, and after the function returns, those local variables will still be the same as before we called the function, etc. So we have a lot of abstractions. It's a job of the compiler to compile those abstractions away and to compile it to assembly where the abstractions are not there. That takes away a lot of work for us, and that simplifies our reasoning as programmers. An important question is, what about if we care about security? What if we want to consider the situation where that assembly code will actually be interacting with other assembly code that we do not trust? Can we then still rely on these abstractions? Can we still be sure if we call an untrusted assembly function that it will return to us after the place where we invoked it? Can we still be sure that if we invoke an untrusted assembly function, that our local variables will still be the same as before we called the function when it returns to us? And in regular compilers, the answer is no. This problem, preserving abstractions in the face of adversarial target language code, is what's known as the field of secure compilation. Okay? And in this paper, we're looking at that in the setting of where the target language is a capability machine. And we're particularly interested in what we see as sort of the last phase of compilation, where we deal particularly with the stack. Sorry, that's my fault. Where we deal with the stack and return tokens and related things. Okay, so a stack. So let's quickly refresh how a stack usually works at assembly level. So we have a stack. We have stack frames. This might be the function. This might be our function. This is our stack frame where our local variables live. We have a stack pointer that tells us where our stack frame actually is located. We can use that to address our local variables, etc. When we invoke a function, we give it a copy of the stack pointer. It increases the stack pointer to address its own stack frame, etc. When it returns to us, we again use our own stack frame. Okay. What if that function we invoke is adversarial? What if that function we invoke is evil, tries to break our abstractions? It can do a lot of things. There's no protections. It can easily use the stack pointer to read and write to our local variables, which we don't want. It can also break our expectations in terms of where it will return. It can easily return to another function, for example, the function that invoked us. It can skip our stack frame, immediately return to the function that invoked us, and which may be something we rely on for security. So can we prevent that? On a regular machine, the answer is probably no, or very difficult. We look at this question on a special type of processor. So we work using capability machines. This is a special type of processor where you have what I see as better security primitives, or more fine-grained security primitives. And let me introduce the primitives as we need them, or as we use them for stack pointers. Okay. So the first thing we will do is, when we give a return pointer to the adversary, we will not just give it to them as a regular pointer that they can look into and dereference and then look at the contents and dereference that further. Instead, we will pass them a sealed return pointer, which means It's sort of an opaque token to them. They can't do anything with it. They can just jump to it. When that happens, control passes back to us, and we can use the contents, but they can't use the contents because they only become available when you jump to it, okay? So we make the return pointer into a sealed capability. Note, by the way, that a lot of the terminology I use comes from the Cherry capability machine, which is a relatively mature capability machine that's very actively developed for the moment, but there are other capability machines in the literature, mostly from longer ago. So this is sort of like focused on the Cherry capability machine, even though it's probably applicable more broadly. Okay. Secondly, we don't just pass the callee our own stack capability, because then again, obviously they can. On a capability machine, we also have memory capabilities that are not just pointers, but they are pointers that include bounds, right? So you don't just get a pointer that you can use to address any part of memory. You get a pointer that includes bounds and that can only be used to address memory within those bounds. For example, for the stack capability, our stack capability would have bounds that run from our stack frame up to all the free parts of the stack. But when we give it to the callee, we don't give it the full stack capability, we just give it the part that it should be allowed to access. So just the part just above our own. Okay? And you might think that this is enough, that this is sufficient protection to make sure that they respect the abstractions that we rely on in source code. And that's unfortunately not true. Okay? Particularly, one thing that this is one example of what they can still do. They could, when we invoke them, copy the stack pointer. They can store it somewhere in heap memory, return to us, wait for us to invoke them again, and then get their old stack pointer from memory again. And now we may have used some extras. Our stack frame may be a little larger than in the previous time, and they can now use that old stack pointer that had authority for up to here, right? They can use that old stack pointer to access a part of memory that's now part of our stack frame, contrary to before where it was part of their stack frame, right? So essentially what happens is that there's no enforcement of the lifetime of a stack pointer. When we give the stack pointer to the callee, it's supposed to use that for the duration of its execution and then not use it anymore, but that part is not enforced. It gets the stack pointer, it returns, but it may have secretly kept the stack pointer beyond its intended lifetime. And the same problem exists for the return pointer. Okay? So, in this paper, we look at a way to prevent that attack. And we use a feature that does not exist on Cherry, that we are sort of hoping that they will implement. There are some people from the Cherry team in the audience, I think, so let me strongly encourage them to look at this. They have already been looking a bit at linear capabilities and not entirely in the form that we need, and they were already looking at it before we proposed it, or we thought of it probably even. And so it's it's an idea that's sort of in the air, right? That many people seem to have thought about at the same time and so on. Anyway, so. Linear capabilities. What are linear capabilities? Linear capabilities are capabilities for which the hardware enforces that they cannot be copied. Okay? Practically, this means that you will have some capabilities that are regular, that behave as before. You can copy them, you can do whatever you want. Some capabilities will be linear, and then when the program tries to copy them, for example, from one register to the other, from register to memory, from memory to register, the hardware will make sure that if you do that, the old copy is erased, right? So you will only ever have one copy in existence for a given linear capability. And the essence, on top of this extra feature in Cherry that we propose for Cherry, we also propose a new calling convention that we call StkTokens that uses this feature to enforce, to better protect stack and return pointers. Essentially, the idea is not difficult. We just propose to make the stack pointer linear as well as the return pointer. And then we can see that the attack that we described before is prevented. So how would this work? We are here in our stack frame. We want to invoke someone. At that moment, we can't just give them a copy of our stack pointer because then we no longer have a copy of our own. So what do we do instead? We split the stack into two parts. One is our private part, one is the rest. We use that part that is ours to build a return pointer that we seal in the same way as before, and we give it to the adversary as a return pointer. Next, we give them the rest of the stack pointer to use as their stack pointer, and we invoke them. And now, because that stack pointer is linear, if they try to store a copy in the heap, that works, but then they have no copy to return back to us. Okay? So the calling convention requires that when you invoke someone, when someone invokes you, you return, you have to give back the stack pointer that you got when you were invoked. Okay? They have no copy to give back to us. We can detect that, and we know that they're trying to somehow cheat or break our instructions. Okay, so this calling convention, it works. And now the question is, in this paper, we wanted to prove what that means it works, right? So we wanted to prove that it gives us the security properties we want, okay? And that was a sort of problem in its own right. So what are the security properties that we wanted, and how do we formalize them? So the properties that we want are kind of clear. We want what's known as well-bracketed control flow and also local state encapsulation. So local state encapsulation is just what we all know as local state encapsulation. No one should be touching our private part of the stack, not for reading, not for writing, etc. Well-bracketed control flow means if we have two functions, this is local state encapsulation, so our local variables, functions that we invoke shouldn't be able to touch them. Well-bracketed control flow, if we invoke a function twice and it returns, then the second time we invoke it, it should return here and not there, for example, right? So it should invoke to the place just after where we invoked it. So that's intuitively. What about formally? How does that work formally? And that's a surprisingly difficult question. There are existing formalizations in the literature, but those are not satisfactory for a number of reasons. And in this paper, we propose an alternative. And the starting point for that is that the security property should help you for reasoning about security of your program. For example, if you have this assembly, this target language program, and you have some instructions, some of those instructions happen to be the instructions for a call. Some of those happen to be instructions for a return. You don't want to reason in terms of the semantics of the individual instructions. A call might be composed of, copying this, shrinking, splitting the stack pointer into two parts, and then sealing one part and jump. You don't want to reason in terms of those individual instruction semantics. You want to sort of look at that call instruction, that call code as a whole, and pretend that it is what you'd consider a call, that it behaves like a call, that it builds a stack frame, and that there's an actual stack even, which we don't in our target language. That there's an actual stack, that these instructions behave like a call, they build a stack frame, they invoke the callee can't access your stack frame, etc. Okay? That's the way we want to reason about our target language code, and this is the starting point for our formalization. What we do is we define a second semantics for our target language. And we call this an overlay semantics, where we sort of special case the instructions that compose a call. We special case those runtime values that are actually stack pointers or stack capabilities. We special case reads and writes to stack capabilities, and we make sure we define their behavior in terms of an actual stack that exists in the operational semantics. And now you can reason in your overlay semantics about your code, knowing from the semantics, from the definition of the operational semantics, that it will behave in a well-bracketed way, that you will have local state encapsulation. What we then prove is that reasoning in terms of that top language is sufficient for proving security properties about your original code. Right? So how do we do this formally? We will consider the identity function as a kind of compiler And we will prove that it satisfies a property known as fully abstract compilation, which is a property proposed a while ago by Abadi as the characterization of secure compilation. And it roughly says what I just said, that for reasoning, for proving security properties in the target language, it's sufficient to prove those same, about your compiled code, it's sufficient to prove those same properties about the original code. Okay. On top of that, you can then build your other passes of the compiler and reason about correctness and security of those in terms of that overlay semantics, not in terms of your target language semantics. That's sort of what's in the paper. To summarize, there's a formalization of a simple cherry-like capability machine with linear capabilities. StkTokens, our proposed calling convention, which uses linear capabilities to guarantee well-bracketed control flow and local state encapsulation. Fully abstract overlay semantics, a discussion of how that relates to other ways of formalizing this. And then finally, our proof of full abstraction, which for those of you who have done such proofs before, you will know that these are not the easiest of proofs. So in this case, we do it using a cross-language step index script key logical relation with recursive worlds. So I think there are a lot of people in the audience who will know what that means, and if you don't, then you have to trust me that this works. Okay, so that's it.
Great. So let's kick things off with the top question on the Slido. Does this work with call CC and continuations?
Well, so that's a good question. Of course, call CC and continuations are precisely the feature that you would add if you don't want well-bracketed control flow. So does that mean that, so I haven't really thought about whether you could sort of selectively have code that is allowed to break these properties and other code that isn't. There might be possible, but we haven't looked at that.
I just have a slight follow-up to that, which is perhaps you could try linear control operators.
And can you elaborate on what you mean by that, or?
Where you're only allowed to run the continuation once.
Oh yeah, yeah. So that probably should be possible. Because your return pointer is linear, you can still store it somewhere in the heap. You're just not allowed to use it twice. So that might be possible. Then, of course, you're probably stuck without a stack for your own use. So one thing we did notice in our proofs is that there are certain limitations that we had to impose. For example, like, I didn't go into all the details, but for example here, one thing you also have to guarantee is that when someone gives you a stack pointer, that the top address of the stack pointer is actually like a single compile time fixed value. And if you don't do that, then it's not like everything breaks, but then you get a sort of slightly different notion of well-bracketed control flow where people are allowed to sort of, in a collaborative multitasking kind of way, sort of selectively stop running your code, start running some other code, and then stop that and continue there. Right? So there are some like parameters you can play here. You can play here with that might allow you to do different kinds of models of control.
Okay, so another related question from Slido: how does this interact with exceptions and building green thread libraries like CML, concurrent ML?
That's another good question. Another question we haven't looked at yet, and yeah, I'm not sure I'm going to be able to give a good answer to that off the top of my head. So yeah, I'd have to think about it.
People have got lots of ideas for further work, clearly. Question from the audience?
I guess the other way to make the stack secure is just not to expose the stack pointer, but have dedicated instructions that push and pop frames and index relative to the current stack pointer. Is there any reason you wouldn't propose that for the sharing machine?
Because then you need to put more intelligence into your processor, right? Then it would be your processor's job of managing the stack, or you would have some kind of trusted intermediary or something. So the reason we like this approach of using linear capabilities is that it's a very nice, like low-level security primitive that you can use for all sorts of different for enforcing all sorts of different properties. For example, your well-bracketed control flow, but also like if you want to enforce linear types, for example, at runtime, or if you want to do other stuff.
So one question I had is, with this kind of hardware stack, does this prevent you from doing things like writing debuggers, which will let you inspect the stack?
I don't see why it would prevent that. No.
Okay, another Slido question. Wouldn't it be easier to do the proof in something like Iris?
That's funny because one of the co-authors is Lars Birkedal, who's one of the Iris guys, in fact. And so the reason we didn't go that direction here is that except for Lars, Lau and I didn't have any experience with Iris, and we chose to do the sort of easier thing, or the more manual thing here. I actually suspect the proof would be easier in Iris, but yeah, we didn't do it here because of lack of experience, essentially. Yeah.
Great. Let's thank the speaker again.